Okay then, this is the nature-nurture debate, and we're fairly familiar with this one, which is good. The idea of nature, obviously, is it's where you've got a characteristic or a behaviour that we've been born with, something that's pre-programmed or innate. And it's often studied with twin studies, as you know, where you compare identical and non-identical twins. If you have a high concordance rate in identical twins, then that supports the idea of nature, because it shows that where genetics are more similar to each other, there's a higher rate than in non-identical twins. And that suggests that something is highly heritable, that it has a large genetic component. Cross-cultural studies showing universality support nature as well, because they support evolutionary explanations. Remember, where you've got the same behaviour shown across many different cultures, it suggests that it may be an evolved behaviour which has evolved to aid survival. There are lots of examples of nature, things like genetic factors, neural factors. Here's some examples that I've put down from aggression, things like the warrior gene, fixed action patterns, that was our ethological explanation, neural and hormonal factors that we looked at. So there's lots of examples that we have looked at where nature plays a really big part in human behaviour. Right, let's look at the other side of it then. Nurture. Our environment starts even before we're born, so we also experience environment that affects our development in the womb. Things like maternal smoking, maternal stress can also affect the baby, so there's things in the environment even before we're born that affect us. Behaviourists take this point of view, that nurture is really important, saying that we born as a blank slate, we develop and we behave according to learning experiences that we come across. And an example of this is the social learning theory of aggression, saying that we develop aggression as a result of observing and imitating others when we're vicariously reinforced. It's supported by empiricism, which we're about to come on to. So, two new concepts here that you won't have come across, two new terms. Nativism is the view that certain skills or abilities are native or hardwired into the brain at birth, i.e. they're innate. And that obviously is a view that supports nature. Empiricism, on the other hand, is the view that the mind is a blank slate at birth, upon which learning and experience writes. So that obviously supports the idea of nurture in behaviour. Right, some more key terms that you ought to be aware of when talking about this. Heredity is the genetic transmission of mental and physical characteristics from one generation to another. And that can be often described with what's called a heritability coefficient, which is a numerical figure between 0 and 1, which says the extent to which something has a genetic basis. So IQ, for example, would be 0.5, which says that actually it does have a genetic basis, a reasonable one, but that actually 50% of it is down to nurture. Equally, height is one that would be, I think, 0.8 heritable, which shows that it has a very, very large genetic basis, but is still affected by environment, by nurture. The interactionist approach is another key term you need to be aware of, and this is when researchers are studying how, rather than trying to disentangle nature and nurture and separate them and look at them separately, this is where researchers are more looking at how nature and nurture interact and influence each other. And then another key term that you ought to be aware of here is diathesis stress. This is a kind of model which emphasises, again, the interaction of nature and nurture rather than separating them, perhaps slightly artificially. So diathesis stress, if you remember, is where you have a genetic vulnerability, which is related to nature, but that vulnerability is only expressed, for example, if it's a vulnerability for depression, that you would only develop depression if that vulnerability is coupled with an environmental stress, which is where your nurture comes in. And so if you have that vulnerability plus the environmental trigger, diathesis stress, you end up developing depression in this case. So it's quite a persuasive model for mental illness. Evaluation then. Nativism and empiricism have controversial implications. So first of all, nativism, which was linked to nature, where you say that inherited genetic makeup determines behaviour, that view's actually led to eugenics, which is where people try and improve the genetic quality, or would like to try and improve the genetic quality of a human population. For example, by encouraging reproduction among people with desirable characteristics and encouraging sterilisation of people with undesirable characteristics. That's a pretty controversial area, as you can see. But on the other hand, empiricism also encourages, if you believe that that behaviour, that we're born as a blank slate and it's all about our opinions, that encourages us to do what's called behaviour shaping, where a population's behaviour is manipulated by rewarding desirable behaviour and punishing or ignoring negative behaviour, which is equally fairly controversial. So both of those points of view have quite controversial implications. One way in which the nature-nurture debate can be extended, that you can talk about in evaluation, is epigenetics. And this is basically a change in genetic activity without a change in genetic code. And our cells contain material that are kind of like on-off switches, where you can turn genes on or off as a result of environmental influences. And these instructions are passed on to our next generation, nature. So you have a nurture influence which ends up affecting nature, which is then passed, so the nature is then passed to the next generation without the nurture effect. So yes, the genes of the next generation are influenced by the environment of the previous generation. So that's a way of looking at how the two interact, how nature and nurture interact together. And one study that supported this was Diaz and Ressler, who gave mice electric shocks when perfume was presented. Those mice, obviously through classical conditioning, became afraid of perfume, the smell of perfume, and showed fear when they smelt it. But the interesting thing was that their children and grandchildren were also afraid of the smell of perfume, despite the fact that they'd never had that nurture influence. They didn't experience the electric shocks that their parents did, but the epigenetics had turned on that fear response to the perfume, despite the fact that they hadn't had the nurture influence themselves. Constructivism is another way that we look at in terms of nature and nurture interacting together, which can extend the nature-nurture debate. So this is where people create their own nurture by selecting environments appropriate for their nature. So for example, an aggressive child, who's by nature aggressive, might make friends with other aggressive children because they feel more comfortable playing with those children than with other children. And so those friends that they select then reinforce and increase her aggression, so that's the nurture influence, but that's as a result of the nature in the first place. So they're creating their own nurture by selecting environments appropriate for their nature. So it's showing the complex interaction of nature and nurture. So we've just seen in a couple of examples that actually it's impossible and illogical to try and separate nature and nurture, to try and assess one or the other. You can never actually separate them, because we experience environment from really early, before we're born, and it doesn't make a lot of sense to try and study either of them in isolation. Twin studies try to do that, but twin studies are still flawed, as you're aware, because we considered that when we looked at aggression. Individual differences mean that even identical twins have different experiences within the same environment. They might not even have the same environment, identical twins, even though they live in the same house, whatever, they still have different environments. So you can't ever actually separate the two. And in psychology, most of the debate has now moved from trying to disentangle them, but instead focusing on the interactions between nature and nurture. And epigenetics and constructivism both consider the nature-nurture debate in terms of looking at how they interact, so they're really good in that sense.